Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Hello. Before we begin, can I ask you all to silence your cell phones? Thank you very much. It's important. I'm Ben Sloat. I'm the director of the MFA in Visual Arts program here at Lesley. I'm welcoming you to our final of our four public art talks this week. The larger thematic has been art as a cultural practice, and I think Mark Dion, our speaker today, embodies this really beautifully. A lot of his works really engage with elements of our cultural vernacular, of the natural vernacular, but more than anything, I think he really ignites our own sense of wonderment and how we can find a lot of value and interest in artistry and personal narrative in the objects that surround us and places that we go to every day. I feel like with Mark, you could talk to him about anything, and he would have something really wonderful to share. A couple things, though. Mark came to speak to our undergrads a few years ago when he was a Stark Most lecturer here at Lesley, and he said one of the most generous things I've ever heard an artist say. So he came in, and there was a room full of students, and the first thing he told them was, "My mother has never read a book." And it was so stunning and shocking and generous, and I actually vetted that with him beforehand, so it's not embarrassing. But it really gave a lot of students who come from all different kinds of backgrounds the kind of agency to move forward in their work and their practice and their interests, regardless of where they're coming from. And I thought that was a really powerful thing to share, and I've heard students mention that several times after he mentioned that. A couple things, though, because yesterday was our first time we've experienced overflow in this for the Mika Rottenberg. We're actually asking people, if you have to leave, please leave through that door. If you have to leave earlier, use the bathroom. And those who are coming in soon will be sent to the video projection, which is happening down the street. So growing pains that we're dealing with. But without further ado, let me introduce Mark Dion.
I'm always having such a good time at these things, and then I remember that, I have to get up and speak. It's always a great pleasure to be back in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the state of my birth, and I'm gonna do a lecture, which is one I have only done once before, so it's going to be rusty. It's not going to be full of the great timing and the jokes, and so please bear with me. I'm still working this one out a little bit. And but like all my lectures, it's very much going to be a travel log. So I'm going to drag you across the world. And where else would we start but Ann Arbor, Michigan? So the Chief Justice of the Michigan Territories founded the University of Michigan in 1817. And he was an extremely unusual character, Judge Augustus B. Woodward, and he believed that there were 13 categories of knowledge, and a university must represent those categories of knowledge. By the way, art and music are not in those categories of knowledge, and he created the kind of car crash of Latin and Greek to describe his institution as a Catholepistomead. And so instead of calling it university, it was the Catholepistomead of the Michigan Territories, and that, of course, is now the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So they wanted to do a project to celebrate the anniversary in 2017, so I was invited to look into this. So I created a project called Waiting for the Extraordinary. And Waiting for the Extraordinary is an experiential installation in which you enter this space, which has all the romance of the Department of Motor Vehicles. And you take a number. You can see here, these are the terms that he used to describe his categories of knowledge. The first one is literature and languages, math, natural philosophy, astronomy, chemistry, the medical sciences, economics, ethics, military science, history, religion and intellectual science, and something known as universal science. So you can hang up your coat there, which you have to do in Michigan. You take a number, and you present the number to the attendant, who possibly is the rudest person you will ever meet in your life. And there's a number counter that you have to stare at. Here it is. And you stare at this, and you stare at it. And if you encounter the person behind the desk, she is instructed, the more inquiries you make, the longer you have to wait, right? And so you'll say, well, how long is this going to be? And she'll say, I think you should just wait. And she'll pick up her cell phone and start talking to someone, and she'll do her nails, and she might apply nail polish and remove nail polish. But there's a group of extremely out-of-date, insanely boring magazines on the 1970s dorm furniture. And then finally, you will be able to enter the space, enter the room. And here it is. And you go inside, and there are a collection of glow-in-the-dark objects. You know, I'm a child very much of the 70s. I never got over the fact that things can glow. And so we went to the different departments that represent these 13 categories of knowledge and tried to find an indexical object. And those were scanned and 3D printed and then turned into these absolutely marvelous, strange things that you enter this room, which is entirely dark. I mean, we had to light it to take these photographs, but otherwise very dark. So you see there a meteorite, a flask, a scanned human heart, an opium amphor from Rome, a human brain that was actually scanned in the skull, and of course, last universal knowledge is represented by Voltaire himself. So these objects are really spectacular. The experience is spectacular. I'm not sure if it's worth that, right? Like waiting for the extraordinary, the extraordinary never quite pays off when you get there. And I worked with a variety of actors, and they were instructed, and they were wonderful, actually. This is a kind of quite unique project. A lot of the sculptural work of mine takes the form of a kind of artifact in a way. So that piece existed in this full performative element, and then the final sculptural work, which exists a year or two later, is a much more condensed thing. It's something that is very much a kind of artifact of this activity and of this process. So it is this tiny room that you cannot enter. You just peer through the window, and it has a lot of the elements that were in the installation, and you peer through the window, and then you can see these objects together. So the first part of this presentation is about these wonder rooms, right? Spaces that are, I'm very much inspired by the interiors that are represented through a number of engravings and woodcuts coming back to the tradition, the 16th and 17th tradition of the Wunderkabinetts, right? The cabinet of curiosity. These gatherings of things that are put together before our disciplined Enlightenment principles, help us divide things into categories and help structure what those things are. What's amazing about the cabinet of curiosity phenomena is, one time there are more than 700 of these existing in Europe at the time, and no two of them are really the same. That they are incredibly idiosyncratic. The Enlightenment Museum is about having the same thing and ordering it in the same way. The Wunderkabinett tradition, what makes it, I think, vital and interesting and cool and relevant today is that they're all idiosyncratic. They're very, very different. So this is actually a piece that it seems almost charming now, because it's a piece about the depressing situation of being stuck 8 years with an idiot as the president, right? So this was done, it's called the Octagon Room, each year kind of representing a year of the George W. Bush presidency. And it's very much represents a kind of phenomena that I saw amongst many of my friends, intellectuals and activists, who in some way retreated inwardly during that time. And we're just so overwhelmed with disbelief and melancholy at how bad things were, that rather than go to the barricades, they did what French intellectuals did during the Nazi occupation. They retreated. They went inside themselves, and I thought, I'm not entirely, I'm somewhat guilty of that myself. So in a way, I've been in a prison. I've been in a prison of my own design, and so this octagon room on the outside is that bunker, and it's making a reference to the fact that this was wartime, even though you wouldn't really know it from looking at the art of our moment. But the interior is kind of the interior of my head, and I hope some of you have seen this work at Mass MoCA and know that this again is an immersive piece. It is a piece that it's an installation work, but it's an installation work that you occupy. It's an installation work that is meant to be interacted with, played with, and like the memory box that was in the ICA exhibition, that means sacrificing a little bit too. That means that people take things that they shouldn't take, people break things that they shouldn't break, people put things back where they don't belong, but in the end, that's an acceptable amount of loss for the experience that most people have, which is a very generative one, and most people, 99.9% of the people who come to work like this behave themselves. So this is filled, again, each year, each wall representing a year on the outside, and then each wall representing a kind of sensibility and an activity. And at this time, a lot of the people who I had came up with in the art world were getting retrospectives, and no one was giving me a damn retrospective. And so, until Ruth Erickson here did so, so I wanted to make my own retrospective in miniature, in a sense. So it's a very large artwork, but in a way it's a miniature of something like the exhibition that was at the ICA. And it invited people to come in and slow down. One of the things that really bothers me about watching how people experience contemporary art in contemporary art museums is they kind of walk through with the same pace that they walk through in IKEA, and I really want to try to slow down that experience and find strategies that make people look more carefully and think more carefully. And, part of that is I put a lot of stuff in these works. So just to visually consume them alone takes a lot of time, not to mention what you might think about that's there. So each of these walls has a lot of these things. So for instance, here we have a wall of a sort of hall of fame, people who have inspired me, people, not necessarily people who I entirely embrace and admire, but certainly people whose contributions have inspired. Everyone from P.T. Barnum to Rachel Carson to Comte de Buffon to Duchamp to Emma Goldman to Robert Smithson, Joseph Beuys, Joseph Cornell, Frederick Law Olmsted. There are a lot of books there that were essential to me. This is a obviously kind of complicated self-portraiture too, but it's a self-portraiture of myself, the artist character, rather than myself, the person, in a way. So that's hard to tease out. But and then also on the mantelpiece, you see these. There are these kind of trophy cups and loving cups. Those are filled with the ashes of my correspondence with my first gallery, American Fine Arts, which was touching because the director of that gallery had passed away, and we had a very close relationship, a very complicated relationship. Of course, it doesn't matter because everything that I sent him, he had a copy of, and now it's all embarrassingly in the archives at Bard. So the world can find out what a terrible speller I am and how desperate for money I was at that time. So, and you have this beautiful William Morris wallpaper. I'm very identified with William Morris as a character and his notions of work and the dignity of work, and also that idea of using nature, bringing nature back into these domesticated spaces that have banished nature in some way, bringing back the influence of nature. These are a lot of the uniforms that I use in my projects, so the costume I wear when I do the Tate Thames dig, or the lab coat that I wear during different projects, and a lot of the apparatus. I'm absolutely obsessed with apparatus. I was just counting that in my house I have a butterfly net in every room. And I don't really need a butterfly net in every room. I don't even need a butterfly net in a single room, for that matter. And there are drawers that you're supposed to pull out, and a lot of them have puns, for instance. So there's a drawer that says shells, and you open it, and it's conch shells and quahog shells from my home. And then you open the next one, and it's spent shotgun shells, right? So apparently this is very... I didn't realize this, but there's a whole group of people who love to get high and go into this place and find these kind of jokes that would make them hysterical. And there are these trophy heads that are covered with tar, and it's a very evocative space. It's a very detailed space, a very careful space, and in some way it's a very melancholy space, and it's a space that is kind of quite tied to contemplation. At the same time, it's theatrical. So I love photographs of artist studios. I love I love to be in an artist studio. I've never seen an artwork that was better in a museum than it was in the studio, right? I mean, but not everyone gets that experience. So this is the Portsmouth Studios, and so now we're going to St. Ives, to Cornwall in England, and St. Ives was this interesting place that drew a lot of artists there. Of course, the St. Ives School, and painters like Ben Nicholson, and of course Francis Bacon was there. And they had studios in this building called the Portsmouth Studio, which was interesting because it was a pilchard storage place. So pilchards are like sardines, basically, and there was an enormous pilchard fishery that was based out of St. Ives. So they would send out boats and they would catch pilchards by the millions, and they would go into the basement of this place where they would be crushed into oil, and that oil would be sold to cities like Paris to light lamps, in the same way that people did whale oil here in Nantucket and New Bedford. So this pilchard fishery was just tremendous, and pilchards, in order to spawn, they need to exist in vast numbers. I mean, that's how their life cycle works. And people would wait on the mountainside, on the mountaintops, to see the shimmering of the pilchards miles out to sea, to know that the pilchards had returned. And it was time to set out the boats to catch them. And of course, one year they had taken so many that the pilchards didn't return, and the pilchards have never returned. And so they destroyed that fishery, they destroyed that phenomena of millions and millions of fish. So there's still a fishery there, and people fish crabs and other things, but not to the extent that there's this enormous industry. So these buildings, these lofts, were extremely inexpensive for artists to rent, and they did, and they worked there, and now it's become a kind of historic site. And the interesting thing was, the top would be occupied by artists, and the bottom, which you see here in the stone, would be occupied by fishermen. So it was this really interesting moment where you had kind of craggy, gruff fishermen and turpentine-angered artists living, drinking, side by side. So they asked me to come and do something there, and I took over one of these basement spaces, and I decided to create a character who could be both, actually. I like that idea of Marx, that one could be a fisherman in the morning and a doctor in the afternoon. Well, in this case, a fisherman in the morning, and also these artifacts that we see from the fishing industry are disappearing as what's left of that industry is disappearing. It's very hard to find young fishermen these days. It's hard to find people who are willing to go out and face the rigors of the ocean and to scrape by this measly living. And so also this kind of material artifacts are missing. And on the other side of the loft is his painting studio. Right, and so we can glimpse his canvas, but only from behind. You can't actually see what he's painting. And then you see the kinds of things that are very familiar in the artist's studio. Reference books, a pin-up board, a heater, portrait of Dante, every piece has to have some emblem of melancholy in it, and his correspondence, his brushes that he didn't adequately take care of. So all of the things that we recognize, and when I make pieces like this, I really always think that the viewer is a little bit like the detective stumbling on a crime scene, right? Your job is to kind of untangle from these clues what is the story here, what is the what is the situation that's being created, who are these characters, how are they reminiscent of the place, how do they go against the grain or confirm that narrative. And of course, as I said, I love apparatus. I love this fishing gear. I grew up around it, and even though it's very different, and one of the things I love to do, of course, is always to mess around with expectations and things. So I did slip quite a few New England fishing things into their traditional things, and so they have, fishermen come through this space and describe and talk about what everything's for, and then they'll be like, I don't know what that thing is, I've never seen it before. That's because it's from New Bedford. Yeah, so those are kind of interior spaces. I also work a lot in exterior spaces, and I think that the realm of art in public places, the realm of public art, is the area where the greatest crimes against aesthetics are created, right? There is nothing worse than public art in many ways. And so I'm always thinking, what could be positive models for public art? So obviously not plop art. Monuments have their problems, as we're finding out now. And so I look back at this other tradition, which I think is really interesting, the tradition of the folly, right? Follies are these 18th and 19th century structures, these diminutive buildings that are created not so much to have a practical function, but rather to create a situation, to signify, to make meaning, right? So they are to felicitate encounters. Facilitate, sorry. And so these are some of these crazy structures that are built. The Temple of Ancient Virtue, for instance. This is very funny because this aristocrat created a temple of ancient virtue. As you see, it's very beautiful and intact. And then he created a temple of modern virtue, but as a ruin, crumbling and rotten. And also looking at other cultures for inspiration. These kind of chinoiserie things, these kind of fantasies. So could we wrestle this tradition away from the aristocracy, away from Orientalism, away from all these other things, and still use this notion of creating structures that create meaning instead of have practical function? And so that's something I've been really interested in looking at. And like all the original follies, they are very place-based. So if I talk about them, I have to talk a little bit about where they are, what they are, the situation, right, and the site. So this structure is on the border of the United States and Mexico in this area that's called the Tijuana Slough Wildlife Reserve, right? So it's right on the border. It used to be a garbage dump. Then it was a place of illegal traffic, particularly during Prohibition. And then during the Second World War, the Navy tested their bombardment. Then it became a kind of unofficial border crossing. And then, of course, this is where the wall that goes into the Pacific Ocean is now. And this is where the Tijuana River evacuates into the Pacific Ocean. So it's an area that wasn't developed largely because of the garbage dump and the bombing. It's next to the Olympia Beach development. Those developers would love to get this land and develop more high-rises. It's adjacent to sprawling California suburbs, which of course are filled with kids who want to ride their BMX bikes in a landscape like this, and park rangers, of course, who are stopping them from doing that. It is on the border, so there are people sneaking across the border, and there are people stopping them from sneaking across the border. It's also adjacent to where the Navy trains their helicopter pilots. So you can't be here without 1 to 4 helicopters overhead, sometimes with Navy SEALs dangling from them. So this is not the most restful wildlife preserve you've ever heard of. But if you are a bird and you need to nest on a beach, this is your best shot in many miles. And if you are a fish who needs to swim upriver to spawn, Tijuana River is the only river in many miles. And if you are a garbage-eating possum, skunk, or raccoon, this is where you sleep it off, right? So everything, all these animals are shoehorned, as are birds that are on the Pacific Flyway, into this park. So I wanted to take something, make a structure that had that vernacular of mischief, right? Something that looks like it's trying too hard to hide itself. Maybe this is left over from when the Navy had this property. Maybe this is something from the immigration cops. It just has that vernacular of mischief about it. And it's sited on a bomb crater where there's lots of wildlife activity. And how you see this piece is you go to the park guard, you give them your ID, she gives you a key. You have to hike about 1.5 miles out, so none of my friends from New York saw this. And then you open this up, and it's kind of like a transformer. You turn the key, and the whole thing opens. And inside, it is a mecca for birders, for bird watchers. It has all the things birders love. Of course, silhouettes and optics and charts and graphs and maps and photographs and recording devices and watercolor paper and equipment and most importantly lists and you can come and just spend as long as you would like in there looking, observing birds and checking out the books and making very bad drawings, which I was left with very many terrible watercolors, and this was here for about 4 months, and not one thing was stolen, right? Not one, no binoculars, nothing else. There are, frieze of images that look a little bit like Elliot Porter, this kind of great triumph of nature photography, birds in their situation, although they are dead birds in natural history dioramas, but nobody needs to know that. There's a bird hall of fame with people, like Marjorie Stoneham Douglas and Rachel Carson and Roger Tory Peterson. There's a instruction guide in case you want to build a bird. There's X-rays of birds who have run into problems in the park, who have been shot or hit by cars and been rehabilitated. As I said, my friends in New York didn't see that, so they're so jealous they commissioned another one. So this is the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit, which is, the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit is in Madison Square Park, which is the park on 23rd Street across from the Flatiron Building. This park probably has the biodiversity of your parking lot out here. And so I manned this with a very charming guy, a very successful DJ, really kind of great, charming, handsome guy who was probably the most ignorant person in the natural world I'd ever encountered, right? I mean, there's very little he could tell you about wildlife. And however, his job wasn't to tell you, his job was to encourage you to come in and to use, again, I'm trying to take the richness of installation art and activate it by putting bodies in it, right? And so you can come in and use the optics and we have microscopes and stereo microscopes and spotting scopes and binoculars. We have, we tried to build this one with a more American Museum of Natural History aesthetic, right? It even has a diorama that features pigeons and rats and roaches and the kind of wildlife you might see in New York. It has an extensive library on mammals of the Northeast and birds of the Northeast. And if that's not enough, you can also take away the field guide to the wildlife of Madison Square Park, which has entries to the things that you actually see in Madison Square Park, like grass and dogs and pigeons and squirrels, all of which have extremely interesting natural history that is entirely bound up with us, right? Even the squirrels in Madison Square Park were reintroduced to Madison Square Park. Madison Square Park is where house sparrows, one of the most numerous birds, if not the most numerous bird we have in America, were introduced there. You could actually buy caged sparrows for a penny and go through the act of releasing them, right, in Madison Square Park. So all of these things everything in Madison Square Park is tied. You cannot separate that kind of nature from culture in an interesting way. Anyway, we made like 5,000 of these and gave them away over the course of the summer. This is one of those great parks where everyone has their lunch, so it's very easy to kind of get people out. So I often think that, my job is to go someplace and kind of find the thread, right? There's something there. What is the red thread? What is it about this place that makes it interesting? Maybe it's something that makes it unique that is so close to the local sensibility that it's not seen anymore by locals. And sometimes you need outside eyes to help reveal something. And or maybe there's something very special that is interesting to celebrate or be critical of. But I never know what that thing is. And it often happens not through the kind of rigorous research, but by chance. So this is Essen. Essen is in Germany, and Essen was the cultural capital of Europe some years ago. And Essen has a lot of problems with hydrology, right? Because it used to be a coal mining region, and there's a lot of problems with you can't bury pipes, for instance, in Essen, which means all the water flow and all the sewage has to go above ground. It's very complicated and inconvenient for people of Essen. But anyway, it's a really interesting place. So I knew I wanted to do something on the border of land and water. And so I went to a site visit, and I made the mistake of doing that in the coldest possible day in February. And it's very flat there, so the wind just rips across. And I wanted to go to this marina where there was water and land, and we go there, and the marina is just frozen solid. In the middle of the marina, there's some birds hunkering down, and then we walk around in this desolate landscape. And at a certain point, just before hypothermia sets in, we see a small construction building, kind of one of these temporary structures, and there's smoke coming out of the chimney. And my guide says, I think we could get coffee here. And so we go over there, and we're shaking. And we open the door, and suddenly out billows cigarette smoke and roaring laughter. And we go into this space, and the walls are like caramel-colored from years of cigarette smoke. And there are these kind of picnicky tables, and there are these big men with big hands drinking schnapps and beer. It's 9 a.m. And there's a bar, and there's pinup girl pictures behind the bar. And I said, where are we? What is this place? And I said, oh, this is the local fishermen's club. I said, the local fishermen's club, when does fishing season start? And I said, well, usually around the beginning of April. And so let me get it straight. These guys come here every day, and they have this rip-roaring time because they have this relationship to these animals. I said, yeah. I said, wow, well, I know what I want to do. I want to make a club like this, but not for machos, but for dandies. And so I found this incredible oxygen tank, right? This tank is meant to pump oxygen into the sewage treatment plant, but they're not using it anymore. And I work with the apprentices at the sewage treatment plant who build me a turret, and they build me a hobbit door, and we open it up, and we create the Amateur Ornithologist Club. And the Amateur Ornithologist Club is a place where gentlefolk can come and discourse on avian life. And, we can sit in our clawfoot chair furniture, and we could bring our picnics and dine on bird-themed plates and put our tea in bird-themed cups. And we can access our extensive bird library or take out optics, and we can talk with the attendant, and she will teach us the fine art of bird identification and make lists of birds that will be seen there. And of course, there's a frieze with names of people who've done a lot for ornithology and for birds. But essentially, it still is a club, so you still can drink. But you can only drink Grey Goose and Wild Turkey cockspur, famous grouse, parrot bay, and you can only smoke larks, of course. And it's Germany, so there is great kitsch, right? There are all these emblems of things that we want birds to be, and we want birds to mean, and we want what we want these birds to associate for us. There's all these kinds of things that we use, like ventriloquists, to make birds signify. And so, and every aspect of this space, of course, is full of bird things. So, I come from a seaside town. I come from New Bedford, and I feel like I'm a little bit in tune with the problems of faded seaside places. And I was invited to Folkestone, England. Folkestone is in Kent. It's like it's on the Channel. On a good day, you can easily see France. It's not so far from the White Cliffs of Dover. And Folkestone once had a booming maritime extraction industry, and they, of course, overfished virtually everything. So now they have a very small maritime extraction industry. But also, this was the place where British people would go before they discovered Ibiza, right? I mean, this is where they would go and have their vacation before air travel. And wealthy, famous Brits would go there. H.G. Wells had a house there. George Bernard Shaw, an American, of course, but had a house there. The Prince of Wales would walk his mistress in the promenade. There were these grand hotels. And, of course, since then, Folkestone has fallen on hard times, right? So there was an attempt by a company that was founded in Folkestone to create a sculpture triennial to bring people to Folkestone so they could see what an amazing place it was and what great bones the city had. The architecture is amazing. The space available is amazing. There are local artists who are great. And so I was invited for this triennial. And I thought, well, what is different about Folkestone from other places I've been? And what struck me was that people hated gulls, like seagulls. They hated them. And you couldn't really go someplace. Yeah, I'd go to a used bookstore and they're, what about those damn gulls? I know, what about the gulls? And of course, I realized after being there for a little while that people hated the gulls because some people love the gulls too much, right? And so those people feed the gulls and foster the gulls, and then gulls are smart. They learn to associate people with food very quickly. And, they're really smart. There's a gull that knows how the Tesco door works, and so she can walk through the electronic door at the supermarket and go in and pick out a bag of chips and take it out. She doesn't know how capitalism works, but she knows how the door works. And they know when it's Friday and people are going to come out of the shops with the fish and chips, and if you zoom by at the right speed and the right angle, you might dislodge those French fries and they all come in. Seems like they're laughing at you, but they're not. So gulls have a problem, and it's a PR problem. So what gulls need is a mobile gull appreciation unit, right? So the mobile gull appreciation unit advocates for gulls, and it travels around the city of Folkestone, and my trained gull enthusiasts with evangelical fervor try to convince people that to know gulls is to love them, and gulls have been studied by ethologists for an extremely long time, right? So we know a lot. You can't speak gull, sorry, but it's very possible to understand a lot of what gulls are saying to each other and to understand their vocalizations and their movements. And so we tried to teach people about gulls. And through this, we found out that those gull haters were actually not a majority, but actually were a minority. It's like the Tea Party. It seems like there's a lot of them, but there's actually less than you think, right? They're just loud. And so so we found out that a lot of people had very touching stories about gulls. They had raised gulls from chicks. They had saved gulls from perilous situations. They continued to have a kind of active relationship with gulls. And so we ended up being this kind of clearinghouse of positive gull stuff, which is not what we anticipated. And of course, there is a book which will help you not talk to gulls, but understand what gulls are saying to each other. So, and again, these are handed out in the Mobile Gull Appreciation Unit. So in thinking about follies, I sometimes work in places where there are actual follies. In fact, this is Castle Graveneck in Austria. So Castle Graveneck is a medieval castle that in the 19th century, the owner decided it wasn't medieval enough, so he built a folly over the castle. So he created a fake medieval castle on top of his real medieval castle, and then built a French garden around it. And French gardens are extremely formal, right? And it's actually, he has a formal French garden and also an English garden. So these are gardens that are like nature volume 10 all the time, right? It's not nature as a process, it's nature as the spectacle. So one of the features of this garden was a box eider hedge. So this is a very dense hedge that was quite low, and it encircled a fountain, and that fountain was hit by lightning, and instead of removing the hedge, the gardeners just let the hedge grow, and it grew extremely high. So this is the hedge, and I came here to look around and think, what am I going to do in this place? And I loved this hedge. I mean, it was such a kind of feature in itself. Unfortunately, the public seemed to think it was the outdoor restroom, which it wasn't. And so the gardeners were like, boy, it'd be great if you could do something in the hedge. So I wanted to take a really traditional folly motif, which is the broken column, right? The broken tower. The broken tower is something that shows something has destroyed before it's reached its prime, right? And I wanted to create this as a shrine to what I think about when I think of nature, which is not nature as a thing, but nature as a process, right? And what is that process? That is a process of death and decay and the recycling of nutrients. So you come to this tower through the hedge, and there through the window is this enshrined monument to mortality and the cycle of life, which unfortunately Bambi is the emblem of. And poor Bambi has, she's passed away. And so you see that he is part of that process of death and rebirth, as there are, of course, flies on Bambi, and Bambi is recycling his nutrients back for the next generation of deer and forests. Okay. I'm taking you to the Arlen Mountains, so I have to put on my Norwegian sweater, because the Arlen Mountains is in Norway, and the Arlen Mountain is never warm. So this is a photo of the Arlen Mountain on the hottest possible day in August, right? It's above the tree line. So Norway, I'm being paid by the Norwegian government to say all these things. So Norway, is this amazing country, right? It has, for the last few decades, become very wealthy because of the extraction of oil from the sea, right? So the profits from that oil, instead of going into the pockets of the shareholders of particular corporations or a family, are nationalized. So they're used by the Norwegian government to build things that Norwegian citizens need, like libraries and opera houses and hospitals and schools and airports and ports and roads. And so one of the big problems was that the road from Bergen to Oslo goes over the Arlen Mountain and other mountains, and no matter what kind of technology and engineering and expertise you have, you cannot keep those roads open all year round. The environment is just too hard. So they solved this by using that money to build tunnels. There's a tunnel that is 26 kilometers long. Did you go under that tunnel?
Oh, no.
It's crazy. I mean, it's 26 kilometers. It's a long time to be underground. And so anyway, so this money was used to create this really interesting infrastructure. So then came the question, what do we do with these great roads? They are open from May to October, and they're beautiful, and they go over incredibly scenic spaces, this tundra, and they pass glaciers and glacial ponds and ancient farms, and they're just stunning. Let's turn that into the tourist road, so people from all over the world can come and drive on these roads and see Norway's amazing natural beauty. Great idea. But that's not enough. It's Norway. Let's hire the most young, forward-thinking architectural firms to build infrastructure, scenic overlooks, gas stations, hotels, rest stops. So they did that, and these are incredibly forward-looking structures. I mean, just amazing, experimental like hell. So they do that for 10 years. Lots of architectural awards. People now go to the road not just for the landscape, but also to see these incredible structures. Then, let's put in the art. So they invited Louise Bourgeois to do the first project. I did the second project. Fishley Weiss has done a project. And it continues. So they brought me to this landscape, and they said, we want you to do something here. And I thought, to fuck up this landscape with a work of art would be such a crime. How can you ask me to do that? I mean, look at this place. It's amazing. So what could you possibly do? So I became really interested in thinking about how we could do something in the landscape that would speak to the landscape and yet not entirely destroy this very fragile tundra. So, and as I became interested in Norway, I was reading a lot about the history of Norway, about, of course, the archaeological history of Norway, Viking burial grounds, and the mythology of traditional Nordic mythology, with its commerce between the underworld and our world, which you find in many mythologies, of course. So I wanted to make this entrance to the underworld, which just happens to be exactly my height, which most Norwegian men are not. So you walk through about 30 feet of darkness, and then you find yourself in a cavern, and in that cavern you are facing a very large diorama. And that diorama is a cave. It's what seems to be a natural cavern. It's very well sculpted, but it has the effect a little bit like it looks more like one of those caverns you might see in the first season of Star Trek than an actual cavern, but there's perhaps a little too much glitter in there. And then there is a very large pile of material culture, starting, of course, with Paleolithic and Neolithic things, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We're going to the beginnings of agriculture, of course, the development of Viking culture, and international exchange, the influence of the classical world, the beginnings of settlements and architecture, and then the Industrial Revolution, international trade, right up to artifacts from our information age, and perhaps, as much as I love Norway, and then, of course, conspicuously, on top of all this, perhaps that you noticed, is a very large sleeping bear, right? And the bear she's kind of just sleeping off this phenomena we call civilization, waiting for that to pass. So, like wilderness itself, she can emerge from this cave. And, in this pristine landscape that I describe of the Arlen Mountain and the tourist road, there are missing elements, right? You go through these landscapes and you think everything is here. Well, there are two things that aren't there, right? And those are wolves and bears, right? The apex predators that compete with us, or at least we perceive them as competing with us. And so those things are the elements that cannot be tolerated and we cannot seem to coexist with. So in this case, this bear has found a place to sleep off the Anthropocene. Okay, I see I'm running out of time. So I am going to talk about just 17 more projects. And so the largest, most complicated project I've done is called the Seattle Vivarium, right? And the Seattle Vivarium is done for the Olympic Sculpture Park, which is a park in the center of Seattle. There was this place, there was a spot in Seattle that had been a petroleum transfer station. So all the developers were terrified that if they bought this, they would have to remediate it, and it would be a disaster and cost a fortune. And the Seattle Art Museum went in and tested it, and they're like, it's bad, but it's not that bad. And so they bought it, and they created a park, unlike Storm King or something where you have to drive out to. It's right in the heart of the city. And they had Teresita Fernandez did a great new commission. Luis Bourgeat did a commission. They brought in a lot of pieces that belonged to collectors in Seattle, Calder's and Oldenburg's and Sarah, and I was invited to do a commission, so I started spending a lot of time out in Seattle. And so, I grew up here, so I've never set foot in a forest that wasn't cut four times at least, right? There is no Massachusetts primary forest, right? Our forests are very much forests of secession. And so the forests of the West Coast are extraordinary, right? They are, first of all, they're temperate rainforests. They get over 100 inches of rain. They've never been cut, many of them. And in a rainforest like that, you would imagine that all the nutrients would long wash out to sea. And that would be the case, except that the nutrients, the energy in that forest, is actually bound into the forest itself, right? So the forest contains that. The trees contain those nutrients and energy. And when one of those trees falls, it begins to release that, and the next generation of forest colonizes that dead tree, and the next generation of forest grows right on top of it. So these things are called nurse logs. And so I wanted to take a nurse log from the forest, like an ambassador, and bring it right back into the heart of Seattle. And Seattle, as a city of European influence, is very young, right? It's all post-photography. Of course, there were Native American settlements going back millennia there, but the European city starts after the invention of photography. You can follow the entire thing. So we had to find this tree. We had to find a tree that was in our target species, right? When people think tree in Seattle, they think big. So, we had to find a tree at least 150 years old. We had to find a tree that we could get to. The local sponsors of the museum are also some of the people who are destroying the last of these forests. And they were very happy to give us a tree. They were like, "Oh, tell us what tree you want. Where is it? We'll get one. We'll fly it in for you." So we're like, "Yeah, we didn't really even talk to you." And then we had the National Park Service were like, "We like the idea a lot. The paperwork to get a tree out of the National Forest would stretch from here to Washington, D.C. and back, and it would come back no." So we finally found the Seattle watershed has protected areas, but they also have an education mandate. They had a tree that fell right beside the road, so we didn't have to build a road to get the tree. And we took that, and we knew exactly the day it fell, which was great. And so we took that tree, unfortunately on the hottest day of the year in Seattle, and we brought it to the Olympic Sculpture Park. This gives you a sense of how that park sits in the city. And then we built this purpose-built greenhouse around it. I love this piece, and I hate this photo, because someone put a fucking garbage can in front of my artwork. And that is just not acceptable. I'm sorry. I don't have another photograph of this without a garbage can in front of it. Anyway, so this is a building that is constructed to recapitulate the situation that this tree was found in. And we know a lot that this forest that this was found in is a very studied forest. So we know a lot about the humidity year-round, the temperature, a lot of those elements, and we have computerized our wonderful, weird building to reproduce those things as much as possible. And it's built with this kind of Forrest Bernini perspective. So you enter into the tip of this triangle, essentially, and the building expands. It's kind of like Doctor Who's place. It's bigger on the inside than you possibly think it could be. And you enter through this vestibule, and again, you see there's a frieze. There's a list of a lot of the people who helped me on this. There are facts about the tree. There's a little bit about where the tree has come from. There's books that have influenced the tree. The frieze, of course, are names of people who local ecologist, national ecologist, and then you enter into the space, and the space is very different once you walk in there. Of course, it smells like you're in the forest, and the temperature is definitely going to be different from what's outside. The humidity is different. The quality of light is very green because we worked with lighting engineers to sample the quality of light under the canopy and to reproduce that. It is loud in here because the building is regulating itself. So when it gets too hot, the vents go up squeaky, squeaky, squeaky. When it gets too bright, shades come down. When it gets too dry, the misters go off. So it feels like you're in the belly of a whale or something. And all of the apparatus it takes to allow this tree to kind of do what the tree is doing is really in the foreground, right? It's really in your face. We're not hiding this in a way. And there's the tree itself, not like a natural history museum exhibit behind glass, but rather right there to touch and see, and all of the creatures falling on the floor and things flying around. And this is it on its first day. We have these really pathetic little ferns. But this turns out to be a spa for ferns. So you put ferns in here, and they grow, 4 or 5 feet within the year, and we have to take our mega ferns out and put them back in the park and take their pathetic ferns and give them a little spa time as well. And of course we have to, because things do, things grow and leave here. Insects fly through the roof. We have to go back to the forest, and we have tarps, and we collect logs and bring some organisms and systems back into this, because this is a garden. It's not a kind of science experiment that you let just do what it's going to do. It is a garden, like all gardens. It is it's a illustration of a philosophy made concrete, right? So it has to function with the message that it's attempting to function with. This is it in situ. So you see this Michael Heizer piece. There's the vivarium. I love that the vivarium's on the street, so people can just stop the car and kind of check it out. There's the Roxy Payne tree, a little bit of Ellsworth Kelly, the creepy Space Needle. Maybe this is the last thing I'm going to show you. This is a piece, I believe it's called The Confectionery Wonders of Buffalo. And this is a work that was done by my wife, Dana Sherwood, and I. We often work in collaboration, otherwise we would never see each other. And we were invited to an exhibition called Beyond Western New York in Buffalo, New York. And Buffalo, New York, I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's a really cool place. It has great architecture, has really interesting cultural institutions, of course, interesting people, and its architectural history is just unbelievably good. So we thought, why don't we combine the architectural history with confectionery wonders? It's obvious. And so we thought we would create 3 categories of buildings. The first category were the buildings from the World's Fair. So there was a great World's Fair, 1900, the World's Fair that really highlights electrical light and what it can be done. It's where, of course, McKinley is assassinated in the music building. And and talk about follies, of course, World's Fair architecture are follies at their best example, right? So the second category are architectural wonders that exist. It's rich in Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and Richardson buildings, right? Buffalo has this amazing architectural history that's still there. And also, Buffalo, like many cities, has been stupid enough to let some of its architectural wonders slip through their hands. So, destroyed things. Frank Lloyd Wrights were destroyed. Lots of things have been destroyed in Buffalo. So, we asked all the local bakeries, we hired them to build one World's Fair building, one architectural treasure that exists, and one that does not, and we exhibited them outside of the only building, the Historical Society, which is the only building from the World's Fair that still exists. And surprisingly, over the course of the exhibition, and this was up for 1 year, these buildings decayed. And it happened pretty quickly. So, this is an asylum. A really kind of like stunning building. Of course, you could see these things at night. Obviously, let's say there are master confectionery bakers here, right? Like, look at that building, and it was visible at night. And then there's some who are not such masters. But they were just really. I mean, this is a grain silo, or yeah, that's right. It's a grain silo that still exists. This is one of the World's Fair buildings, and of course, you would think like pretty soon this is going to get active, right? It's going to be a biological process that's going to happen in this space. Except Buffalo is freaking cold, and so at a certain point, everything is just arrested in this very unusual crystalline form. So this is the way a lot of that. This is how it spent a lot of time. So, I have a question for you. I can go on to the last category of things, or we could stop. It's been 1 hour now.
More.
All right, people can leave if you want. I will shame you, though. So I work also with museums, and museums somehow think it's a great idea to ask me to help them reorganize their collections or things like that, and I'm very excited and happy to do that. And sometimes I work on specific exhibitions. So this was the largest exhibition in Berlin on the history of science. It was an exhibition called Weltwissen, World Knowledge, 300 Years of Science in Berlin, and so there are very rigorous historical exhibitions within this exhibition about chemistry, about art history, about the biological sciences, about the Nazi perversion of science during the Third Reich. So very, very complex. So I was invited to do something that would be an introduction to that, to talk a little bit about the material richness of this. And so I had built this incredible Wunderkabinett, right? Each one of these cubes is 2 by 2 meters, so 6 by 6 feet. And I had to try to represent what are all of those sciences that exist within the university structures in Berlin. And there's a number of universities. There's Charité Hospital, there's Humboldt University, there's the Freie University, and they are all rich with material culture going back at least 300 years, and from the natural sciences to the social sciences to the hard sciences, all represented somehow in here. So I had to find all of these great things, but you actually don't see the exhibit at first through the way I just showed you, but rather you enter through the back, and you see these silhouettes of these objects, almost like these kind of Platonic ideals of what these strange things are. Again, just to emphasize the scale. This is what would be, I guess, if it was a conventional house, would be 4 stories high, and it also torques. So it is a hemisphere, right? So, which I think you can appreciate a little bit here, and so it is absolutely full of stuff. And we start on the left-hand side with the natural sciences, starting with what do we start with? We start with geography and geology and the earth sciences, and then go to the studying of microorganisms, and then to the study of plants, and then mushrooms, and then animals, invertebrates, eventually vertebrates. And on the other side, you have all the sciences ending with the information science, so it's early computer. And there's just like a lot of stuff here, and everything has great significance. So there are also telescopes, and you can look through this telescope, and if you hit an object like the horse skeleton, you find out that that's Emperor Maximilian's favorite horse. And when the horse died, he had the skeleton, he had it flayed, and the skeleton displayed on one side of the entrance, and then the skin stuffed on the other side of the entrance. And the skin has not survived, but the skeleton has. So you go through all of the natural sciences, as I said, and then you go to the sciences of humans as animals, and then physical anthropology, to medicine, of course, then humans as producers of culture, ethnography, and then to things like art history, engineering, and if you go to this there's this kind of silvery cone, inverted cone there. That's one of the speakers from Hitler's Nuremberg rally, because not every year of science in those 300 years are positive years. I mean, there's a lot of very dark things in that history, including, the sort of Nazi perversion of science. Science for them is it's almost like we're going back to Chief Justice Woodward. It's everything except music and art and theater and literature. So it's very much, we're back where we started. Another museum I had the pleasure of working with is the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco, right? The Oceanographic Museum in Monaco is really the best thing about Monaco, right? It's this amazing museum. It was built in 1901. In 1901, there's a lot of different ways you could build something than this, right? Modernism is in full force in 1901, and yet this is built like a kind of princely palace. This is built maybe in like what we could call the High Victorian style. But the first Prince Albert of Monaco was not only the head of state, not only the owner of all of the casinos, as Prince Albert today is, but he was also a very decent cetacean systematics person. So he was a whale scientist. And when he could shirk off his duties as the head of state, he would sail off with his marine biologist buddies, and they would go to the Arctic or to the Azores, and they would do oceanography. So they would sample currents, they would fly kites to sample the atmosphere, the marine biologists would capture dredges to go to the bottom of the ocean to bring up things that have never been seen before. They would harpoon whales and dissect them. So they had this floating laboratory, and he wanted to build. So this is the front of the building. This is the back of the building. He wanted to build a cathedral, a palace to the ocean that was the marriage of art and science. So Ernst Haeckel, who wrote the book, this German evolutionary biologist, who wrote the book Art Forms in Nature, which I'm sure all of you have seen. It is still in print, right? It's the book that has these decorative diatoms, right? He was the guiding light. So every gargoyle there is not a gargoyle, it's an actual organism. It's a walrus, or the gates are created to look like octopi, right? And on the floor are designs not of angels and dragons, but deep sea creatures in all their savage glory. And the chandeliers are in the shapes of jellyfish. The sconces are in the shape of seahorses, right? So I should have an oceanographic museum jacket I could wear for this. And so this is, it's 2 stories of museum, 2 stories of aquarium, and 7 stories of research laboratories and storage, right? That go out to the sea where his boat would be, and marine biologists work there to this day, right? I mean, they have a lot of things still going on. This is what it looked like in 1910, right? This is the Hall of Marine Vertebrates. This is the Hall of Oceanography. So everything that they did, of course, they had to invent tools to do this. They had to invent things to sample deep-sea crabs. You can't buy that off the shelf, right? You can't call BioQuip or Carolina Biological Supply Company. So this is entirely devoted to their apparatus that they study. Of course, there is a whale room, which was the pride and joy of Prince Albert. And, one of the greatest conservationist wildlife filmmakers of all time took over the management of this place later. Jacques Cousteau, personal hero of mine, great filmmaker, great advocate for ocean conservation and ocean health. Perhaps not the best museum director you've ever heard of. So, he turned that into a kind of push-button, kind of aesthetically challenged, kind of like what the Boston, the Children's Museum of Science looked like in the 70s, like that kind of horror. Yeah. And here he is with, of course, Grace Kelly and whatever his name is. And so this is what the museum looks like now. They are trying to reestablish, kind of like going back to what we really have here is a museum of a museum. So can we still discourse on ocean health and have exhibits about contemporary science, and at the same time preserve our culture as a very specific kind of museum, right? And so they invited me to install works in there, which of course my work already looks like it's in the museum. So it's very hard to tease out, like, what exactly is the Mark Dion project in here? Because it all looks a little bit like that, right? And it does. And so, but more importantly, we decided to work on this project like all museums. The Oceanographic Museum in Monaco only shows about 5% of what they have. So museums normally show between 1 and 10% of what they actually have. So that stuff that's in the basement, in boxes, isn't doing anyone any good. So I always want to turn the museum inside out. So I came up with a kind of scheme and of what we could do to possibly bring some of those things out of those cardboard boxes. And this is my wife, Dana Sherwood, and I. Again, we work together very often. We spent a lot of time searching through these collections of hundreds of thousands of things, right? And to create this, which is a permanent installation. I should say that the Walter Wissen exhibition I showed you, that cabinet cost 800,000 euro. And it existed for 5 months, and then it was turned into scrap metal. So, it's crazy, right? And so this project is actually permanent. So this has, in the very bottom, there are the publications. This institution has been publishing and made very beautiful and rich scientific publications and continues to publish aggressively. On the left-hand side, you have, in the flat part of the vitrine, you have the very small things which no one would ever show, like the bryozoa and the fossil crinoids and these kind of things. And then we have different cabinets with specimens, wet preparations in them, representing different expeditions. So we have like Cousteau's expedition to the Amazon, for instance. And above we have all of these marvelous things that were created for the original museum that are not considered today's technology, so they disappear behind the scenes. On the right-hand side, the museum has this dedication to collecting also art that is made from ocean things. So coral carved things and cameos and some like incredibly kitschy ugly things. And then we have also Albert himself and these wonderful collection of paintings that were made underwater, because of course you can oil paint underwater. And it's true. And so there are, and so this is a way, again, as I said, I'm interested in that kind of visual effect of the Curiosity Cabinet. So helping the museum to move forward by looking back at those intensive ways of representation. That's my last slide. Woo! You're welcome.
Fascinating presentation. I understand that some of your projects, site-specific projects, are temporary and some are permanent.
Yeah.
So with the permanent ones, what's the kind of maintenance?
Yeah.
Is it both logistically and financially? Are you involved, or?
I mean, in that case, it really belongs to the museum. Everything in there belongs to the museum, and it is it's in a very prominent space. So. Occasionally, for instance, I'm in contact with the curator and the collections manager, and they're actually very careful about letting me know if things change or having suggestions. For instance, there's a new kind of boat that they're working on in Monaco that is not petroleum driven, And so they wanted to put that in the cabinet and wanted to know if something could be substituted. So they're in contact with me all the time about that. And they also want to know, they're always feeling that people don't see this thing as an artwork, which of course I don't really care if they do or not, but they want. I'm always trying to figure out, like, okay, what can we do signage-wise to make that more flagrant? So we do have a pretty strong, and there's also other artists who could exhibit in that space, and at least one of them has asked that a wall be built to hide the piece while they had their exhibition. That's the kind of artist camaraderie.
Is that part of a contract, or does it happen?
I think it is part of a contract, actually, and I'm pretty flexible about it. But there's also the contemporary art space in Monaco, and they're like a little less flexible than I am. Every time something happens in there, they call me like, "You won't believe what they did." And I'm like, "Yeah, they told me they were going to do that." Well, it ruins everything. Not really. So it's very funny.
So with all these projects, if you are attached to, at least occasionally attached to the maintenance of some of them,
Yeah.
that's like a job, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, it's sometimes, like, for instance, the Seattle Vivarium one, that has this team of docents, and I don't know how many there are now. There have been as many as 40 at one time. And it's only open when the docents are there. And the people who, a lot of them are retired people, a lot of them are people who were the docents at the museum, and then they felt more comfortable at the vivarium because a lot of them had worked in forestry industry. And so they kind of keep it alive, and they protect it, and they let me know if there's something that's a problem. And if I'm passing through Seattle, I go and chat with them. But at this point, they know more about it than I do. It's kind of incredible. So, I mean, that's a really interesting situation where, the museum doesn't have the resources to keep a person there all the time. But it has this piece has created around it a community that have adopted this thing, and they are the ones who keep it going. Yes.
Thanks, Marco. That was great. Great to see all of a lot of the work together. I'm curious, with your interest in 19th century modes of categorization, indexing, if you thought about or considered working with 21st century sort of internet-based forms of indexing and archiving, which are an extension of that, obviously, but have gotten much more sophisticated.
I mean, I have worked with contemporary systematics people. I mean, it's quite complicated because contemporary systematics is really complicated, right? And I worked with the Natural History Museum in London as the artist in residence at this kind of moment where there was a tension between the traditional comparative anatomy taxonomists and the new molecular systematics people, and so we had to find these interesting ways for them to have a dialogue, and they were not really so fond of each other. Some of them, of course, most people realize that these are just two ways to do the same thing, and actually they complement each other very well. However, they were extremists on both sides who also didn't want to talk to each other. So I created a car with a sticky roof, and we drove the longest road of London, and then all of the insects that hit that car we brought back, and we had like a contest between the molecular people and the orthodox the comparative anatomy people to find out what these things were, and of course, most of them are going to come up with the same results, except that one of the molecular organisms came back. They thought it was a grain of rice because, of course, they were reading the stomach contents of this thing by accident. I mean, something happened, and so for the comparative anatomy people, they were like, yes! and also the comparative anatomy people were much faster at what they would do. But also, we found an organism that had never been seen in London, which was a South African beetle. So that was, imagine how many of those kinds of things around. But I'm like a thing guy, so anything on the internet is just not my. I'm really into material culture, so.
That's the other thing, if you'll allow me just to extend off the question. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your interest in the aesthetics of the 19th century and sort of this intersection with nostalgia, and I don't mean that in
Yeah.
a bad sense of the word.
Yeah.
Maybe I do, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think 19th century, but also, or early 20th century, or even today. You know, I've done a lot of, I've recreated like what a sort of contemporary genetic lab bench looks like today. So, I mean, I'm interested in the idea that the science kind of has an aesthetic in a sense, and that is an interesting aesthetic in the way that, you know, an art gallery has an aesthetic. That, you know, the art gallery is the same if you're in Portland or if you're in Mexico City or if you're in Cape Town, in the same way that the laboratory kind of feels the same if you're in Tokyo or Buenos Aires or Seattle. You know, that's, you know, something that is imagined as neutral actually still forms an aesthetic. So, but yeah, I do focus a lot on the 19th century, I think, because I think we're still very much kind of grappling. I mean, that is when the kind of revolution in the biological sciences happened, and we're still grappling with a lot of those kinds of problems, and some of those issues that are set there are, you know, we're kind of arrested in that moment in a way, and a lot of the debates are kind of teased out in that moment. But also I do have an absolutely like personal affinity to things that are made well, and, you know, things that that are well crafted and thoughtfully crafted, and also I find, you know, because there's a withholding of information in a way in the 19th century museum. You know, they you know, most science museums, most places like that to me are, you know, they not only answer the question, but they kind of ask the question. So you as a viewer become like this passive person. I'm just reading my way through the museum. Whereas somehow often the labels have gone missing in the 19th century museum, and you get this way of you know, there's a kind of pleasure in putting it together for yourself in a sense, and also it's not of our moment, and so the authority of that museum has decayed a little bit, so you can push back. You know, like when I go into the art museum, I don't feel like I'm being told what to think, because I'm not supposed to agree with everything that's in there. I can look at a work and think, no, this is garbage. I mean, I hate that. It's not really, this is not a perspective I have. And that's kind of encouraged in the art museum, but that's not really encouraged in other kinds of museums. You can't really do that in, say, a social history museum or a natural history museum. Yes.
In your recreation of these science labs and natural history museums, there's this moment where there's all these moments of fiction and absurdity that's happening in these displays, and I'm wondering when or how those make their way into your process, and what's the importance of those elements in the content of your work.
Well, I mean, I go to a lot of labs and archives and things, and I think people always ask, do scientists ever like confront you about this? And I said, well, you know, they kind of get it. They know that I'm not a scientist. Not all art people know I'm not a scientist, but all science people know I'm not a scientist. And you know, but science people also have, I think that very often we are in tune with humor and irony. You know, I have never ever been to a laboratory anywhere where there's not a Far Side cartoon taped to the wall. Like, I can't think of a single one I've ever been to. Like, I walk in, I'm like, where's the Far Side cartoon? You know, because it's going to be there. And I think that that's a kind of you know, there's a kind of quickness about that. And you know, I try to make work that rewards careful viewers, right? The more time you spend with a piece, the more things you're going to see, and the more jokes that you might get, and the more art historical references you might get. You know, it's important if there's a, you know, if there's a typewriter in a piece, that it's an Underwood, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff like that I build into the work, but if you're just doing a walk by, you're not going to see it. And so, and you know, and there's a lot of self-referential things. There are things that no one will get because they're quite personal. You know, I try to, you know, I grew up in New Bedford, and we have this thing called humi chow mein, which is like what the kind of thing that my mother fed us every Thursday. And I always try to sneak a box of humi chow mein into every installation. And, nobody knows that, but it's there. Yes.
So your work also spoke to this incredible fluidity in the freedom to pursue collective knowledge from cross fields. Science, obvious one, and many other, archaeology, anthropology. I wonder if you can speak a few words about your own personal pursuit, testing out these fields and how you nested in the methodology of the power of being an artist and combine them all.
Well, I mean, I really am, very careful to say I'm not a scientist, I'm not an archaeologist, and I know plenty of people in those fields, and I know what I do is not that. And I want to be kind of respectful of those disciplines, and I don't think I tremendously grasp these things, although I do have a somewhat functional understanding of a lot of these pursuits. But the making of the work is also part of how I understand these things. But I do think about these disciplines as cultures that have unique material culture, right? I think that in a way, I am perhaps sometimes intentionally misunderstand the material culture of these things, like an ethnographer, kind of ethnographer of archaeologists, or an ethnographer of biologists, in a sense, looking at their material culture, and in the same way that an ethnographer who's doing a display can often get things wrong, I often do get things wrong. And so I think that for me that's part of the test and part of the fun, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not obliged to get things right or tell you the truth or any of those things. So that's one of the things that makes quite a big difference. And at the same time, I do want to do work that gives a nod to the amateur and to the dilettante, who I think is, certainly the amateur is an often under-recognized figure in these pursuits, although I think is being revalorized through citizen science and things like that. And I am also, of course, drawn to this moment where there really weren't any professionals. I was just looking at the Asa Gray stuff and in the Harvard Herbarium today, and he was like the botanist in America. There were lots of people who call themselves botanists, but he's kind of like the only professional botanist, and there are lots of plant hunters and other weird characters. And, that's such an interesting moment where everyone else there's kind of only one person in the profession, but at the same time he's doing a lot of other stuff, including managing that department and building that department. Yeah.
I wondered, as a student, as a young artist, how did you develop your logic, your artistic voice? It's so unique and idiosyncratic.
I don't know, because I think I think that there's a lot of people who showed me the way. I mean, certainly if you think about Smithson's relationship to geology, you can't really understand Smithson's work if you don't understand a little bit about geology. And Smithson sort of understood geology as the science of time. And so that relationship, to me, he is a kind of pivotal character in that he reaches out of exclusively the fine art tradition to another discipline and learns from that and uses that as the basis of, he's interesting because he's using a lot of things. He's using geology, but he's also using science fiction, and he's also, he's using a whole series of things to create this kind of work. So I think there were, in some ways, some models maybe that I looked at, but also I think, like most artists, you make the strongest work about the stuff you care the most about and the stuff you love, right? So I'm interested in the natural world. I grew up in a place where I had a lot of contact with that, but I'm also interested in the museum world. And I think, I kind of my interest in the natural world led me to, if I couldn't get out to go to Bear Mountain every weekend, I could at least get to the Natural History Museum in New York. And that was really, and then it took me a long time to really understand that the critical toolbox I was building at the Whitney program and SVA, studying with people like Craig Owens and Benjamin Buchloh and Martha Rossler, that was something I could apply. I didn't have to apply it to the things they cared about. I could apply it to the things I cared about, which is the culture of nature. And then from that, I sort of started to discover, people like Stephen Gould using this same kind of critical approach, or Donna Haraway, or Alex Wilson, all of these people who are kind of doing that. William Cronin, these people were not. I wasn't exposed to them in school in the way that it might be very easy to be exposed to them now. So I had to kind of seek them out myself, and that took a little bit longer than it should have. It would have been nice if I had had a little guidance. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting and important. And I kept picking up on this notion of melancholy that you were kind of speaking about. And, going back to 19th century modes of production and inscribing them in a kind of neoliberal context, when the relationship between the public sphere and the private sphere is so different from the moment of the emergence of these museums and these modes of collecting and the follies. And so in, the Norway project, the Seattle project, the Austria project, there's this intense kind of necropolitical dynamic, the kind of melancholy and death that we don't get out of. And how do you see that as a kind of proposition in terms of how to maneuver through that, since there's such a disjunction between the kind of 19th century modes of public and private and the neoliberal kind of deregulated public space that you're working in?
It's interesting because I think that of that 19th century period as, I think about this our modern period, it kind of bookended, right? Between, on one hand, the Wunderkammer, which is maybe the earliest expression of the beginning of what would become like a very brutal colonial endeavor, right? I mean, it's just that the Wunderkammer is not the Imperial Museum later, but it's a step toward that, and it's not. It's certainly not innocent from that endeavor. It's really a kind of stepping stone at the very beginning of that. So I see that, and that is also enshrined somehow in the idea of wonder, right? And in the 19th century, kind of like the middle point in a way of with some of the things that you're talking about, where you have this kind of full-on state apparatus of the representation of nature functioning with a kind of colonial imperial capital vision. And then now I think we have this real melancholy, whereas the wonder is in this moment of discovery where the Europeans are kind of having their mind blown because the world is much bigger than they ever imagined, and it's full of things that they never imagined, and it's full of plants and animals and people, all of which can be exploited, of course, but they never imagined. So there is this kind of astonishment, and then now we have the opposite of astonishment. We have mourning as these things disappear. I absolutely do not know a way out of that, and I am extremely pessimistic, right, about where we're going, and I don't really see avenues of resistance that I can identify as potentially doing anything. I wish I could. I'd be happy to be part of that, but I just don't see it.
Can you share with us a little bit about how you found your first gallery and moved from kind of dialing for dollars with them to being in a more comfortable financial state?
I'm not in a. I stand before you as a man who has not paid his rent and whose car just broke down, and I'm 2 months behind in my healthcare payments. I mean, my wife and I are on the edge all the time. Like, I would say 4 months a year we cannot pay our bills, and so there is. I mean, this is hard. This art stuff is a lot harder than I thought it would be. It's really. It is truly desperate. I mean, we live a totally, kind of shocking life, and
I know how old your shirt is because I have the same one.
This shirt is actually brand new because my son bought this for me for Christmas. But yeah, no, it's really, and I work with galleries, and but I can kind of hobble together a living by doing multiple things. So I work with galleries, and occasionally they sell something. Maybe they sell a sculpture a year or something, and then I also make drawings and prints, and those do okay. And I also teach, and that helps a little bit. And I do things like this, and I do these projects with museums. There's a fee involved in some of those. The large scale projects, something like the Norway project, that it sounds like it has a big fee, of like $60,000-$70,000, but it's over 3 years, right? So, it's maybe if I didn't live in New York, it'd be a little easier. I think about that a lot, but it's really, it is a struggle all the time, and it's really boring.
Thank you for being honest.
Yeah, you're welcome. Someone had a question over here?
When I went through the exhibition at the ICA, nothing prepared me for something you said and discussed in the video, and it was low and people were chattering around, so I may not have heard correctly, but it was when you were talking about working for an art restorer, and I think there was some deceit involved in something that they were doing, and how you hated the art restorer for that.
I don't think I hated him for that. It is a kind of tell-all video, though.
So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit about the art restoration part of what you did.
Well, that is a piece from like 1986, so it's a long time ago. But I was working as an art restorer at the time. At the same time, I was going to school at the Whitney program and was very close with Jason Simon, documentary filmmaker, and we were very interested in the kind of new documentary, the kind of stuff coming out of France in the 60s and coming out of London in the 70s, and so a lot of what we looked at and thought about and worked on were documentary film things. And so I wanted to make something like a challenging alternative documentary, although as a character, that was my job, and those stories are all real in a way. So, but I think it's always complicated for me because I think of my art self as a character, as kind of character person, but I also think of myself as someone else, and sometimes it gets very fuzzy. It's really hard to tell, but I like that. I like impurity anyway, so that it doesn't really torture me, but at the same time, and it doesn't give me an identity crisis, at the same time it's really hard to tease the public persona and the person apart sometimes. I know I'm not really answering your question at all.
I think there was someone had come to the store to make something better.
The film is about a series of changes that were going on, but that in which the marketplace is changing the art, right? By painting things out, but this is like literally changing it by painting not just the perception, but actually physically changing things, painting things over, cutting pictures down so they fit in fancier frames, all of these kinds of things which are very real. And we think about art restoration conservation as this almost sacred duty, like they're almost as important as librarians. But when you are not in the museum, when you're in the marketplace, things happen very differently. And I think this was also, in the same way that the Octagon Room is like a Bush era work, right? That was a Reagan era work. It was all about the kind of changing of history. Like suddenly Vietnam was okay. We just spun it a different way. All of this kind of things that were going on at that moment. This was a little bit of a metaphor for some of those. Yes.
One of the coolest things I think about your work is how it seems like reveal this sort of semi-fictive relationship we have with animals and architecture, but also like this semi-fictive relationship we have with ourselves. I'm just wondering if like I know that one of the first pieces you showed us, it was sort of had like these autobiographical elements like towards your interests
Yeah.
and stuff. And I'm wondering like the relationship, like if there's a relationship that you're having with yourself and doing the other pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think I'm trying to. I mean, there are things in them that are almost like keeping me interested as well. Like, and there are things that, you know, I mean, I am egotistical enough to imagine that someday in the future people might think about these things, and then they will discover this thing, which, you know, is probably not going to happen. You know, but at the same time, you know, those nuggets are planted there. And if someone knew me, and you know, and it's really difficult to be an audience for this work because it's spread out over the globe, right? And so it's hard to actually see things, although things like the ICA and the ICA catalog do a lot to make it a little more tangible. But I do an awful lot of work. I mean, you know, probably knows that most of this stuff was not represented in the ICA show, and I wanted to show that intentionally, to show a different kind of work and a different kind of approach from that exhibition, which is really a sculpture exhibition. Yes.
Yeah, Mark, I just want to ask if you could elaborate briefly on a lot of your work. It pays tribute to the nature of the history of research, the history of the museum, and the history of this knowledge. And you just mentioned how by envisioning this past, we can envision the future, and that last work with the museum.
Right.
And I was wondering if there was just a few things that we could say that is a lot of your work about that in a way. Trying to like almost plant seeds for like at least looking back.
In a way, well, I think that there are strategies and technologies and methodologies in the past that, because of their moment and because of what was done with them, are quite corrupted, right? But maybe there are aspects of those things, and follies, of course, is one of them, and possibly museum display could be one of them, and also something like traveling can be very much this kind of traveling as the expedition could be one, but there are also nuggets in those things that can be resuscitated in a positive, progressive way, perhaps. So I am trying to rescue some of those things. At the same time, have a very comical relationship to how, you know, how they function. You know, so I've done a number of projects, for instance, where I follow in the footsteps of a famous naturalist. But I do it in a totally Pee Wee Herman kind of way, right? And so, and I do it with lots of mistakes and lots of ways to undermine the mastery aspect of that, and largely because I do believe that travel is an incredible producer of knowledge and can be an incredibly positive thing if one goes with not an imperial attitude, but with a very open attitude to actually learn something instead of discover what you already imagine is there, right?
Should we do one more question?
Okay. Let me know. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming, and I feel like we've had a lot of really good questions. Mine is a little bit smaller, but I'm wondering if there's anything you've watched or listened to recently, podcasts, small things, even NPR, say, that have sparked your interest and maybe pushed you forward into thinking.
Well, you know, I'm really interested in this kind of planet Earth phenomenon that's going on right now, the whole ocean plastic stuff. You know, I've done a little bit about ocean plastics, but I'm very good friends with an artist named Pam Longobardi, who has been working on ocean plastic issues for a long time, and you know, and through her, you know, I've really become quite educated about ocean plastics because she's just a great teacher, and so to see that go into the popular realm is very interesting, and to imagine, you know, I mean, ocean health issues is something I really care a lot about, and it's hard to imagine how one can do something around those issues in art, and so it's very interesting to see it now in the popular realm, and that it has kind of reached this point where there is this kind of advocacy, and you can't watch those programs without somehow being touched, I think, and so that's very, for me, that's kind of fascinating. Yeah. All right, thanks, everyone.